The limousine was moving through downtown Seoul at exactly 9:47 in the morning, when Kim Tae-jun's entire life changed direction. Not slowly, not gently. The way a cliff crumbles, suddenly, completely, and without any warning at all. Outside the tinted windows, thousands of people lined the streets of Gangnam. Some held cameras, some held flowers. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders to catch a glimpse of the most talked-about wedding South Korea had seen in a decade. Banners hung between buildings. News helicopters circled overhead. Every major television channel in the country was broadcasting live from the venue, where 500 guests from 14 different countries were already seated in imported white chairs, sipping champagne and whispering about how lucky Han Seo-rin was to be marrying the most powerful man in the country. Kim Tae-jun was 38 years old, 6 feet tall, and worth $11 billion. His company, Kim Tech Global, employed over 40,000 people across Asia, Europe, and North America. He had been on the cover of Forbes 3 times. He spoke 4 languages. He had negotiated deals in rooms where heads of state sat quietly and listened. And yet, as he sat in the back of that limousine in his perfectly tailored black suit, a single pale rose pinned to his lapel, he felt absolutely nothing. Not excitement, not joy, not even nervousness. Just a hollow, quiet emptiness that had lived in the center of his chest for 10 years and never once left. His assistant, Park Jun, sat across from him reviewing the day's schedule on a tablet. His lead security officer, Cho Woo-jin, sat in the front passenger seat with an earpiece in his ear and his eyes scanning the crowd. 2 more vehicles followed behind. 3 motorcycles flanked the convoy. Everything was perfect. Everything was completely wrong. Tae-jun loosened his collar slightly and stared out the window. The convoy was approaching Hangang-dairo, where the road widened before curving toward the Han River venue. Traffic had slowed to a crawl near a busy pedestrian crossing. Hundreds of people were crossing. Office workers, students, mothers pushing strollers. The ordinary rhythm of a city that did not stop moving simply because a billionaire was getting married. Tae-jun wasn't looking for anything. He wasn't thinking about anything except the hollow feeling in his chest and the vague, persistent suspicion that he was about to make a terrible mistake. Then he saw her. She was standing at the crossing, waiting for the light. She was wearing a simple cream-colored blouse and dark trousers, her natural hair gathered away from her face, a small canvas bag over one shoulder. She looked older than he remembered, calmer, more settled in herself, more beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with effort and everything to do with time. Sasha Williams. His heart didn't just beat faster. It stopped. Completely. For 3 full seconds, Kim Tae-jun forgot how to breathe. Beside her stood 3 boys. They looked about 9 years old. They were dressed identically in white shirts and dark shorts, arguing with each other in the way that only brothers argue. Loudly, passionately, and without any actual anger. The tallest one was pointing at something across the street. The middle one was laughing with his entire body. The shortest one tugged at Sasha's sleeve and said something that made her smile. And when the tallest boy turned his head and looked toward the road, Tae-jun felt the air leave his lungs completely. The boy had his smile. Not similar. Not a coincidence. The exact smile. The one in the photographs his grandmother kept. The one his mother used to point to when she spoke about the Kim family bloodline. The upward pull at the left corner. The way the eyes narrowed slightly before the full smile arrived. Tae-jun's hand was on the door handle before his mind had formed a single coherent thought. "Sir," Park Jun looked up from his tablet. "Stop the car." "We're on schedule, sir. The ceremony begins at—" "I said, stop the car." Woo-jin turned around from the front seat. "Mr. Kim, we're in the middle of a convoy. The press is—" But Tae-jun had already opened the door. The noise of the city rushed in. Camera shutters, crowd noise, a news helicopter somewhere above. He stepped out onto the road in his $11,000 suit and walked directly toward the pedestrian crossing, ignoring the gasps around him, ignoring the shouts of his security team scrambling out of the vehicles behind him, ignoring the sudden explosion of camera flashes as reporters recognized him and began moving in his direction. He saw only her. Sasha saw him at the same moment he reached the curb. She went completely still. The canvas bag slipped from her shoulder, and she caught it automatically, but her eyes never left his face. The three boys fell silent beside her, sensing the shift in her energy, the way children always sense things before adults understand them. 10 years. 10 years of silence. 10 years of unanswered questions. 10 years of waking up at 3 in the morning and staring at the ceiling and wondering what he had done, what he had missed, what had gone so terribly wrong. They stared at each other across 3 feet of pavement, while the city moved around them like water around 2 stones. Sasha. His voice came out quieter than he intended. She opened her mouth, closed it. Her eyes were filling, but her jaw was set. She had the look of someone who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, and now that it was here, every rehearsal felt completely useless. Tae-jun, just his name, nothing else. His security team arrived around him, forming a loose barrier between them and the gathering crowd. Reporters were pushing forward. Someone was calling his name. A camera drone had appeared somewhere above. Park Jun appeared at his elbow, whispering urgently about time and schedules and media optics. Tae-jun heard none of it. He looked at the 3 boys, who were now watching him with enormous, careful eyes. Then he looked back at Sasha and asked the question that had followed him for 10 years, like a shadow that never shortened, regardless of how bright the sun was. "Why did you leave me?" Something moved across Sasha's face. It wasn't anger, though anger was underneath it. It wasn't sadness, though sadness was underneath that too. What moved across her face was something older and heavier. The expression of someone who has carried an injustice for so long that the weight of it has become simply part of who they are. She looked at him for a long, steady moment. Then she said, "I didn't leave you. Your mother made sure I had no choice." The ground disappeared beneath his feet. He heard Park Jun stop talking. He heard Woo Jin shift beside him. He heard the distant sound of the news helicopters and the crowd and the city. He heard all of it from a very great distance, as if he had suddenly dropped 30 feet below the surface of everything. "What did you say?" "You heard me." Sasha's voice was steady now. She wasn't crying anymore. She had made a decision. He could see it in her eyes. The decision to finally stop carrying this alone. "I said your mother made sure I had no choice, but Tae-jun," she paused, and her gaze moved to the boys beside her, and then back to him. "We cannot have this conversation on a public street while you're supposed to be getting married. Not like this. I'm not going anywhere." He said it like a man who had just realized how much of his life had already gone somewhere without him. "Not until you tell me everything." Sasha searched his face for a long moment. Then she looked at her boys. The tallest one was watching Tae-jun with an expression that was half suspicion and half something he was clearly trying to suppress. The middle one had moved slightly closer to his mother. The smallest one was still looking at Tae-jun with complete, open curiosity. "Ethan, Elijah, Emmanuel," Sasha said quietly. "Step back with Mr. Cho for a moment, please." Woo Jin, who had worked for Tae-jun for 7 years and considered himself unshockable, looked extremely shocked, but he moved to collect the boys without a word. Sasha looked at Tae-jun and took a slow breath. "10 years ago," she said, "your mother called me." He went still. "She asked me to come to the house. You were in Busan for the merger conference, the one that lasted 4 days. I remember because I had just found out I was pregnant, and I was trying to decide the right moment to tell you. I was so happy, Tae-jun. I was terrified, and I was so happy. His chest tightened in a way that was almost physical pain. When I arrived at the house, Madame Kim was waiting in the main sitting room. She was very composed, very polite, the way she always was when she had already decided something and was simply informing you of it. Sasha's voice was measured, but her hands had tightened around the strap of her bag. She had documents on the table. She told me you had contacted a lawyer, that you wanted the marriage dissolved. She showed me papers with your signature. She showed me text messages from your phone. She showed me emails. She paused. Everything looked real. I was 26 years old, and I was alone in that house, and everything looked completely real. Tae-jun's voice came out in barely a whisper. I know that now. Her eyes met his directly. I didn't know it then. I was too young and too frightened, and I loved you too much to believe you could do that to me. But the evidence was right there in front of me, and she was so certain, so completely certain, that I started to believe I had missed something, that somehow I had never really known you at all. He felt sick. Then she told me that if I did not leave quietly, she would contact immigration. I was on a spousal visa, Tae-jun. She knew exactly what she was threatening. She told me she would ensure my family back home would face difficulties. She told me she had already spoken to several lawyers. And then, Sasha's voice finally cracked, just slightly, just for a moment. She told me the kindest thing I could do for you was to disappear, that you were embarrassed, that you had moved on, that staying would only humiliate us both. The silence that fell between them was total. Around them, the city still moved. A van horn blared somewhere. The crowd behind the security perimeter had grown larger. 2 police officers had appeared, drawn by the commotion. Park Jun was on his phone, speaking rapidly. None of it existed. I left that night, Sasha continued. I flew to London, then to my aunt in Atlanta. I had nothing. I had $50 in my account, and a pregnancy I hadn't told anyone about, and a marriage I believed was already over. She exhaled slowly. I cried for 3 months straight. And then I decided that crying wasn't going to raise 3 children, so I stopped. 3, he repeated. She nodded. Her eyes went to the boys, and the love in them was so enormous and so fierce that it made Tae-jun feel briefly ashamed of everything he had and had never appreciated. I tried to reach you, she said quietly. You should know that. I tried many times. Letters. Emails. I even called the company once and pretended to be a client just to get past reception. Something moved briefly across her face that might have been a painful laugh. Every letter came back unopened, or didn't come back at all. Every email bounced, or went silent. Every call was rerouted. I tried for 18 months before I finally accepted that whatever your mother had told me about how you felt must have been true, that you simply didn't want to know. She intercepted everything. He said it flatly because the alternative was to say it, with every emotion currently colliding inside him, and he didn't yet know how to do that in the middle of a public street. Yes, Sasha's voice was equally flat. I worked that out eventually, about 4 years ago, when Ethan started asking questions about his father, and I went looking for old emails, and I found something in the routing that didn't make sense. By then, she stopped. By then, it felt too late. You had your life. I had mine. The boys were fine. I told myself it was better to leave it alone. It wasn't better, he said. No, she agreed. It wasn't. They looked at each other. 10 years of silence. 10 years of a life that had been hollowed out and handed back to them in pieces by a woman who believed she was protecting something worth protecting. Then the boy called Emmanuel pulled free from Woo Jin's loose supervision and walked directly up to Taejun and looked up at him with his mother's eyes in his father's face and said, with the complete fearlessness of a 9-year-old, "Are you really our dad?" The question hit Taejun like a physical thing. He crouched down, right there on the pavement in his wedding suit. He looked at this boy, this small, serious, entirely unafraid child, and his throat closed completely. "Yes," he managed, "I think I am." Emmanuel considered this for a moment with great seriousness. Then he nodded once, as if confirming something he had already suspected. "Mom has a photograph of you," he announced, "from when you were younger. Ethan says you look different now because rich people age differently, but I think you just look older." From somewhere, behind him, Taejun heard Woo Jin make a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Taejun looked at Sasha over the boy's head. She had one hand pressed over her mouth, and her eyes were completely full. He stood up slowly. He looked at Ethan, who was watching him with guarded, measuring eyes from a careful distance. He looked at Elijah, who had moved to stand close to his mother, but was watching Taejun with an expression of careful neutrality. He looked at Emmanuel, who was now examining the rose on his lapel with complete scientific focus. Then he turned to Park Jun, who was hovering at his shoulder with the desperate expression of a man watching a very expensive ship sail directly toward a very obvious iceberg. "Jun." "Sir, the ceremony is in 40 minutes. If we leave now, we can still call the venue." Park Jun blinked. "Sir, call the venue, Jun." Taejun's voice was entirely calm. "Cancel the wedding." The words fell into the air and just sat there. Park Jun stared at him. Woo Jin turned around fully. Even Emmanuel looked up from the lapel rose. "Mr. Kim." Park Jun's voice had dropped to an urgent whisper. "There are 500 guests. There are 12 news channels broadcasting live. Miss Han is already at the venue. Your mother is... Cancel it." He said it a second time with the same absolute calm, and that was when Park Jun understood that his employer had never been more serious about anything in his life. "Call Miss Han directly. Tell her I need to speak with her privately. Tell her I'm sorry, and that I will explain everything. But cancel the ceremony." He paused. "Now, Jun." Park Jun looked at him for one more second. Then he raised his phone to his ear, with the expression of a man who had just been asked to detonate something very large and very expensive, and had no choice but to do it anyway. At the wedding venue, the first sign that something was wrong came when the groom's personal assistant called the venue coordinator and asked her to pause the processional music. Han Seo-rin was in the bridal suite on the second floor, standing in front of a floor-length mirror in a gown that had taken 8 months and 6 designers to create, when her own assistant knocked twice and entered with a face that told her everything before a single word was spoken. "What happened?" Seo-rin said. It wasn't a question. "Miss Han." The assistant's voice was very careful. "Mr. Kim has called and asked to postpone the ceremony. He says it's urgent and that he will explain everything in person." Seo-rin looked at her own reflection for a long moment. Behind her, 3 bridesmaids had gone completely silent. The makeup artist had set down her brush. The room held its breath. "Postpone," Seo-rin repeated. "Yes, miss." "Or cancel." A pause. "He used the word postpone, miss. But his tone suggested cancel." Seo-rin nodded once, slowly. She reached up and touched the pearl necklace at her throat, a gift from Taejun's grandmother, given at the engagement dinner with warmth that Seo-rin had always sensed was more polite than genuine. "All right." She exhaled slowly through her nose. "Get me my phone, please." Outside, in the venue gardens, the 500 guests had been informed that the ceremony was experiencing a brief delay. The polite announcement had lasted approximately 4 minutes before the footage began circulating on social media. Tae-jun stepping out of the limousine. Tae-jun standing at the pedestrian crossing talking to a woman. Tae-jun crouching down to speak to three boys. Three boys who looked, to anyone paying close enough attention, remarkably like a younger version of Kim Tae-jun. The internet had theories within minutes. Within the hour, the theories had become headlines. In the Kim family mansion on the northern edge of the city, Madam Kim sat in her private study and watched the footage on the television with a stillness that her staff had learned over many years to be afraid of. Her personal secretary stood near the door and did not speak. A half-drunk cup of tea sat on the desk beside her. She had worked very hard, for 10 years, to ensure this particular problem would never resurface. She was beginning to understand that she had not worked hard enough. When Tae-jun arrived at the mansion 2 hours later, he came alone except for Woo-jin. He had not gone to the venue. He had spoken to Seo-rin by phone, a conversation that had been brief and painful, and honest, in a way that their entire 2-year engagement had somehow never managed to be. Then he had driven to the mansion. Madam Kim was waiting in the main sitting room, the same room, Tae-jun realized, as he stepped through the door, where she had once sat across from a terrified 26-year-old woman and dismantled her life with forged documents and carefully chosen threats. She was 64 years old. Her posture was impeccable. She was wearing a pale gray suit, and her hair was set precisely, and she looked at her son with an expression that was equal parts fury and something that might have been the very first tremor of fear. "You have humiliated this family," she said. "Hello, Mother." He sat down across from her. He did not raise his voice. He had decided on the drive over that he would not raise his voice. He had decided that she had already taken enough from him, and he was not going to give her his composure as well. "I've spoken to Jung-ah." Jung-ah was the household manager. She had worked for the Kim family for 22 years. She had been working for the family 10 years ago when Madam Kim had met privately with Sasha Williams in this very room. "Jung-ah is a servant," Madam Kim said coolly. "Whatever she told you, she told me about the documents. She witnessed you having them prepared." He placed his phone on the table between them. On the screen was a recorded conversation. "She also told me about the private investigator you hired to monitor Sasha's email account for 18 months, to intercept correspondence." He paused. "She saved documentation, Mother. For 22 years she has worked for this family, and she watched what you did, and she saved documentation because she didn't know what else to do with it." The temperature in the room dropped several degrees. "I did what was necessary. You forged my signature." His voice was still calm, still quiet. And somehow that quietness was worse than shouting would have been. "You forged my signature on divorce documents. You threatened my wife with deportation. You cut off every attempt she made to contact me for over a year. And you did all of this while I was in Busan, believing that my wife had simply decided to leave. While I was in Busan, I want to point out, negotiating a merger that made this family $300 million. He let that sit for a moment. I spent a year thinking I had done something to drive her away. I spent another year trying to understand what it was. Then I spent 8 years learning to live inside an emptiness that was never supposed to be there. Madam Kim's jaw was tight. She was not suitable. She was my wife. He said it simply, as if those 4 words were sufficient. Because they were. "Tae-jun." Her voice shifted slightly, the frost warming just enough to let something else through. Not regret, not yet, but a recognition that the ground was moving. "You were 27 years old. You were infatuated. These things pass. If I had not acted. I have 3 sons." He watched her face. Something moved across it, a flicker that she controlled immediately, but not quite quickly enough. "You knew, didn't you, that she was pregnant when she left? Or you suspected?" Silence. You suspected, he said, and you let her go anyway. Madam Kim looked away for the first time. Her eyes went to the window, and the garden beyond it, and the city beyond that. Her hands, folded in her lap, tightened slightly. I thought, she began. I don't want to know what you thought. He stood up. I want you to understand what you did. You separated me from my wife. You separated 3 children from their father. You manufactured 10 years of absence from whole cloth, and you have spent 10 years watching me be unhappy, and you said nothing. Not once. His voice finally showed its first edge. I looked at you across the dinner table 100 times and asked you if you had any idea why Sasha left, and you looked me in the eye and said nothing. Madam Kim's chin lifted. I was protecting. You were controlling. He said it without heat, without drama, just a fact. You have been controlling since the day I was born, and I have allowed it because I believed, somewhere, that you knew better, that you could see things I couldn't, that the choices you made came from love, even when they were painful. He picked up his phone from the table. But there is no version of love that looks like this. There is no version of protection that requires a man to spend 10 years alone and 3 boys to grow up without a father. He turned toward the door. Tae-jun. Her voice behind him held something that she rarely let into her voice. Something raw. He paused without turning around. She stopped, started again. I believed I was doing what was right for the family, for you. I genuinely believed that. He was quiet for a moment. I know you did, he said finally. That is somehow the worst part of all of it. He walked out. In the weeks that followed, the story became impossible to contain. The financial press covered the cancellation angle, the impact on the Kim family's alliance with the Han conglomerate, the stock fluctuation, the board meeting that followed. The entertainment press covered the romance angle, the billionaire, the ex-wife, the triplets, the wedding that never happened. Social media covered every angle simultaneously and with tremendous enthusiasm. Tae-jun ignored all of it. He rented a house in Mapo, a quiet residential neighborhood where Sasha had settled years earlier, choosing it specifically because it had good schools and a park nearby, and absolutely no one who cared whether you were a billionaire or not. He enrolled the boys in a nearby school. He learned where the grocery store was. The first time he tried to help Ethan with his mathematics homework, Ethan sat across the kitchen table from him, with his arms folded and his jaw set at an angle that was so precisely his own expression that Tae-jun had to look away for a moment to compose himself. You don't have to do this, Ethan said. I know. Mom managed everything fine without you. Yes, she did. He looked at his son directly. That doesn't mean I don't want to be here now. Ethan was quiet for a moment, turning his pencil over in his fingers. Why weren't you here before? It was the question that mattered, the one that deserved a real answer, not a comfortable one. Because someone made sure I didn't know you existed, Tae-jun said, and I'm not going to lie to you and tell you that's not something I'll spend the rest of my life being angry about. But I'm here now, Ethan. That's all I can give you. I can't fix the time that's already gone. I can only be here for what's left. Ethan looked at him for a long time. He had his mother's eyes, watchful, measuring, generous in their own time and not before. Then he uncapped his pencil and pushed the textbook toward his father and pointed at question 7. Progress. Elijah was quieter about it. He was the middle son, thoughtful, careful, the one who absorbed things and processed them in private before he allowed himself to feel them. He was the one who came to Tae-jun 3 weeks after he had moved nearby, on a Sunday morning when Sasha had gone to buy groceries, and the 3 boys were technically in the garden, but actually all inside watching television. He sat beside Tae-jun on the sofa and looked at the television and said, without looking at him, "Do you love our mom?" Tae-jun turned the television off. "Yes," he said. "I have loved your mother since I was 24 years old at a conference in Singapore, where she was working as a junior interpreter, and she corrected my English in front of 12 executives and didn't apologize for it." He paused. "I have never, in all the time since then, stopped loving her. Not for a single day." Elijah absorbed this. Then why didn't you look for her harder? It was a fair question, an honest question, a 9-year-old's question that cut straight to the part that Tae-jun himself had spent the most time examining. "Because I was a fool," he said simply. "Because I was proud and I was hurt, and when someone showed me what looked like evidence that she had chosen to leave, I believed it instead of believing in her. And that is not her failure. It is mine." He looked at his son. "I'm sorry for that. Not to you, though I am sorry to you as well. But I am especially sorry to your mother, who deserved better from me." Elijah sat with that for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, with the gravity of someone filing information away for later consideration. Emmanuel, meanwhile, had decided that the matter was entirely settled and had moved on to a campaign to get Tae-jun to teach him how to drive, which Sasha had vetoed firmly on the grounds that Emmanuel was 9 years old, and which Emmanuel had responded to by pointing out that several YouTube channels confirmed that some countries allowed provisional licenses at 14, and he was willing to wait only 5 more years, which was practically nothing. Tae-jun had looked at Sasha over Emmanuel's head with an expression of pure, helpless delight, and she had laughed. Really laughed. The full, unguarded laugh he remembered from Singapore and Jeju Island, and the tiny apartment in Taiwan where they had lived for the first year of their marriage. And for the first time in 10 years, the emptiness in his chest had something else inside it. Still, he was careful. He was deliberate. He understood that love that has been interrupted once by interference and silence does not simply resume. It has to be rebuilt. Differently. On new ground. With new honesty. He and Sasha talked more in those first 3 months than they had in years of marriage. Because in marriage, they had been young and in love and in a hurry. And now they were older, and they had both survived things. And the conversations they had were different. About what they wanted, about what they feared, about what had broken them and what had held, about the boys and the future, and the kind of family they wanted to be. He told her about Seo Rin. "I should have ended it earlier," he said. "Long before I did. I think I knew it wasn't right. I think I was afraid that if I didn't build the life I was supposed to have, I would have to admit how much of the life I wanted had already been taken from me." Sasha was quiet for a moment. "Did she know? About me?" "No, not until that day." He paused. "She took it with more grace than I deserved. She told me," he stopped, remembering. "She told me I had belonged to you long before I belonged to her. She walked away. She didn't make a scene. She just walked away." Sasha was quiet for a moment. Then, "She sounds like a strong woman." "She is." He looked at Sasha. "So are you." What happened with Madam Kim came in its own time, the way some things can only come in their own time and cannot be rushed without breaking. She had a cardiac episode in the 4th month, not severe, but frightening enough. The doctors used words like stress and isolation and required lifestyle modification. Her staff called Tae-jun. He went. He had not expected what met him when he arrived. The boys had insisted on coming. All 3. Sasha had offered to keep them home, but they had, collectively, firmly, unanimously, refused. Ethan had said, with the same straightforward directness his father used, "She's still our grandmother. Whatever she did, she's still our grandmother." And that had been the end of the discussion. Madam Kim was sitting up in the hospital bed when they walked in. She was wearing a plain blue hospital gown, with none of the armor of her usual clothes, and she looked older than she had the last time Tae-jun had seen her, and smaller somehow, which was disorienting because she had never in his life seemed small. She looked at the three boys, and something happened in her face that Tae-jun had not seen since he was very young, since before his father died, and she had armored herself against the world and decided that love was a strategy rather than a feeling, something that wasn't composed, something that wasn't controlled. Emmanuel walked directly to her bedside and said, with complete seriousness, "You're not allowed to die yet. We just found out you exist." Madam Kim made a sound that was entirely unlike her, something between a laugh and a sob. Ethan stood near the door with his arms folded, but his eyes were soft. Elijah stood beside his mother and watched his grandmother carefully and said nothing, which said everything. Sasha came last. She stood at the foot of the bed, and Madam Kim looked at her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Madam Kim said quietly, "I was wrong." Sasha held very still. "I was wrong in what I did, in how I did it, in every decision I made that day, and in every day afterward when I could have corrected it and chose not to." Her voice was thin, but it was direct. It was, Tae-jun thought, perhaps the most honest thing he had ever heard his mother say. "I told myself for 10 years that I had protected this family, but what I actually did was—" She stopped. She looked at the boys. She looked at her son. "I looked at what I had destroyed, and I called it protection, because the truth was too difficult to look at directly." Sasha was quiet for a moment. "I'm not going to tell you it didn't hurt," she said. "It hurt more than I have words for a very long time. I know. I'm also not going to tell you that everything is forgiven and forgotten, because it isn't. It may take a long time. It may look different than what you expect." Madam Kim nodded. "I understand." But Sasha glanced at the boys, at Emmanuel, who had now appointed himself guardian of the bedside table and was examining the water jug with tremendous focus, at Ethan, who was almost smiling, at Elijah, who had quietly moved to sit in the chair nearest the bed. "These are your grandchildren, and they have already decided that you are their grandmother. I'm not going to be the one who takes that from them." She paused. "So we start from here.